He was her only child, her world, her reason to live. After her husband's sudden death, one grieving mother poured every ounce of love into her son, till love turned to obsession. Every woman he dated mysteriously disappeared from his life, and when he finally found someone worth marrying, she ended up in a coma, poisoned. But the truth wouldn't come from detectives or DNA. It came from the woman herself during a hospital interview. She didn't know would expose everything. Margaret Holloway had always prided herself on being a devoted wife and mother. Her life revolved around her husband Robert and their only child Daniel. They lived a quiet, middle-class life in a modest home in the suburbs of Cedar Ridge. Robert was a respected math teacher at the local high school. Margaret stayed at home, managing the household and ensuring Daniel grew up in a stable, loving environment. To outsiders, they seemed like the perfect family close-knit, peaceful, free of drama. But everything changed in the winter of 2014. It was a rainy night when the police came to Margaret's door. Robert had been driving home from a late parent-teacher conference when a drunk driver veered into his lane, killing him instantly. News shattered Margaret. Her entire world crumbled in a single moment. She collapsed on the floor, clutching her chest, and let out a scream that echoed down the hallway. From that night on, something inside her changed forever. In the months that followed, Margaret struggled with depression. She barely left the house, refused to attend therapy, and turned to her son for emotional support. Had just started building a life of his own. He had landed his first real job as a graphic designer and was renting a small apartment in the city. But after the funeral, he moved back home temporarily to comfort his mother. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. What began as a gesture of love turned into something else entirely. Margaret clung to Daniel with an intensity that made others uncomfortable. She cooked for him, did his laundry, and constantly texted when he was away. When he tried to go out with friends or mentioned dating, she suddenly felt faint or overwhelmed with anxiety. She never asked him to stay, but her emotional outbursts made sure he did. She crafted a world where they only had each other. And for a while, Daniel didn't question it. He believed he was just being a good son to a grieving mother. But as the years passed, Margaret's behavior became more controlling. Daniel noticed how she seemed to dislike every woman he mentioned. Even casual dating turned into conflict. If he brought someone home, Margaret would act cold, condescending, or outright rude. The moment he broke things off, she'd smile and say she never trusted her anyway. Daniel didn't see the pattern at first. Maybe he just had bad luck in love. But Margaret was quietly orchestrating every failed relationship behind the scenes. She created fake social media accounts to stalk the women he dated. Sometimes she would message them pretending to be concerned friends, warning them about Daniel's unstable behavior or past aggression. In other cases, she would follow them in her car, park near their jobs, or leave notes under their windshield wipers. It was always anonymous, always distant, but always calculated. Daniel remained unaware. To him, his mother was simply overprotective. But to those who crossed her path, she was a force to be feared, a woman who had turned her grief into something darker. Margaret's need to keep Daniel close wasn't about love anymore. It was about possession. In the spring of 2021, Daniel met Emily Sanders at a networking event in the city. She was everything he'd been looking for: kind, compassionate, and emotionally intelligent. Emily worked as a nurse and had an intuitive sense for people's pain, both physical and emotional. Her calm presence immediately drew Daniel in. After a few dates, their connection deepened. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something. Real Margaret sensed it right away. The first time she met Emily, she forced a polite smile, but her eyes were sharp. She asked questions laced with judgment. Where was Emily from? Why was she still single? Was she religious? Emily, ever graceful, answered with poise. But Margaret hated her instantly. She hated her charm, her poise, her independence, and most of all, she hated the way Daniel looked at her. Emily didn't fit the mold of the women Margaret could easily push away. She wasn't intimidated by coldness. She had worked in a trauma unit. She had seen far worse than a disapproving mother. Emily was patient, giving Margaret the benefit of the doubt. She offered to help around the house and made sure to include Margaret in plans. But nothing worked. Margaret refused to warm up. Daniel began spending more nights at Emily's place. They talked about moving in together. Within a year, he proposed during a weekend getaway, and Emily said yes. When Daniel told his mother the news, Margaret barely reacted. She stood still, then slowly walked to the kitchen without a word. That night she cried for hours. But they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of rage. Margaret felt like her entire world was being stolen. She had spent years building a fortress around Daniel, keeping other women out. Now, Emily had slipped through, but Margaret wasn't ready to lose. She needed something powerful, something that would stop the wedding and bring Daniel back under her care. So, she created a new story. She was dying. The next week, Margaret claimed she had been feeling dizzy, tired, and nauseous. She booked an appointment with her longtime doctor, someone who had always admired her resilience. She exaggerated symptoms, faked fainting in the waiting room, and burst into tears. After running some tests and seeing Margaret's distress, the doctor hesitantly mentioned the possibility of something serious, maybe cancer. That was all Margaret needed. She left with enough ambiguity to spin her narrative. Within days, she sat Daniel down and told him the news. She had a rare, aggressive form of cancer that had spread to her liver. She cried in his arms and said she didn't want to tell him before the engagement, but now she couldn't hide it. Daniel was devastated. He canceled his upcoming move with Emily and started staying at home again to be there for his mother. Margaret wore scarves on her head. She spent long hours in bed and asked Daniel to cancel social plans. Emily became suspicious. Margaret never seemed to lose weight, never had any medication lying around, and always got defensive when Emily asked for details. But Daniel refused to believe his mother would lie about something so serious. That belief would almost cost Emily her life. Weeks passed. Emily did her best to remain supportive. Despite her suspicions, she volunteered to help care for Margaret. She drove her to appointments, cooked for her, and tried to bridge the growing gap between mother and son. Margaret pretended to welcome the help, but behind closed doors, she resented Emily more with every passing day. Her plan was working. Daniel was pulling away, but Emily's presence was constant, and she needed to go. Margaret began researching poisons. She scrolled through online forums, true crime threads, and historical cases involving natural toxins. Eventually, she found what she was looking for: digitalis, a potent substance derived from the foxglove plant, was once used to treat heart conditions, but in the wrong dose, it could slow the heart to a deadly rhythm, cause symptoms that mimicked cardiac failure, often without immediate suspicion. And the best part, it was virtually undetectable if administered in small amounts. Margaret found a local garden store that sold ornamental foxglove seeds. She claimed she was planting a memorial garden for her late husband. She grew them in a hidden patch behind the shed, dried the leaves slowly, and ground them into a fine powder. She kept the mixture in an empty vitamin bottle, hidden behind cleaning supplies. The opportunity came during a dinner party. Daniel had convinced Margaret to allow a small celebration at their home to mark their engagement. Emily offered to cook the meal, and Margaret insisted on making dessert her signature lemon tart. She added the powder carefully, measuring just enough to induce severe symptoms but not kill. At least not immediately. Emily ate 2 slices. The next morning, she woke up with nausea, dizziness, and blurred vision. By mid-morning, she collapsed in her kitchen. Daniel called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors were baffled. Her heart rate was dangerously low, but no existing conditions explained the symptoms. They placed her in the ICU, uncertain whether she would survive. Toxicology results took days. When they came back, they revealed traces of digitalis. One had poisoned her. Emily remained in a coma, and the hospital quietly notified the police. Daniel was horrified, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, praying she'd recover. Meanwhile, Margaret brought flowers to the hospital room and sat by his side, whispering that maybe it had been bad shellfish or a virus, but Margaret was nervous. She began asking the nurses questions, strange ones. She wanted to know if Emily had said anything, if the doctors were investigating, if police had spoken to anyone. One nurse noted the odd behavior and flagged it to her supervisor. The staff began documenting everything. As word spread about Emily's poisoning, local media picked up the story. A journalist from a regional news channel reached out to the Holloways, hoping for an emotional perspective from the family. Margaret agreed to speak, eager to control the narrative. She dressed carefully, wearing a gray cardigan and light makeup to present herself as a grieving future mother-in-law. During the interview, recorded in a hospital conference room, she spoke softly about Emily's kindness and how tragic the situation was. But halfway through the recording, she made a crucial mistake. The reporter asked what Margaret remembered from the night of the dinner party. Margaret described the evening in detail, too much detail. She said, Emily had eaten 2 slices of the tart and barely touched her wine. She even mentioned that Emily had complained about a bitter aftertaste. That was a problem because no one outside the hospital knew how much Emily had eaten. That detail had never been shared. The police had kept it confidential to screen for possible suspects. Detectives reviewed the interview and immediately flagged the comment. It was enough to justify a search warrant. The police raided the Holloway home days later. In the garden, they found remnants of foxglove plants hidden behind the shed. Inside the trash, they discovered an empty capsule bottle labeled vitamins. Margaret's laptop revealed a disturbing search history. How to poison someone. Naturally, digitalis dosage for adults, and can hospitals detect plant poisons? Faced with the evidence, Margaret was arrested at home. Daniel watched in stunned silence as his mother was taken away in handcuffs. He couldn't understand what was happening until the police showed him her browser history. The betrayal cut deep. Everything he had believed about his mother collapsed in a single moment. Margaret Holloway was charged with attempted murder, tampering with food, and obstruction of justice. Her trial became a media sensation. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Former friends came forward with stories of how controlling she had become after her husband's death. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a woman consumed by obsession, who saw no one as good enough for her son even if it meant murder. Emily eventually recovered, though the trauma haunted her. Her kidneys had suffered damage, and she required weeks of rehabilitation. She never returned to the Holloway home, and her relationship with Daniel, though loving, was never quite the same. The shadow of betrayal lingered. Daniel, crushed by guilt and confusion, moved out of the city. He and Emily stayed in contact but never married. In court, Margaret showed no emotion. When asked why she did it, she said only that she wanted to protect her son. Her journal, presented as evidence, told a different story. In its pages, she wrote of her sacred bond with Daniel, her belief that no woman could love him purely, and her conviction that Emily was a liar in disguise. Her words were not those of a mother. They were the ramblings of someone who had confused love with control. The jury found her guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison. As she was led away, she turned to look at Daniel one last time. He didn't return the gaze. The case became a chilling reminder of how devotion can become dangerous when twisted by grief and obsession. Margaret Holloway wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. She was a mother who believed she knew best.